How do you feel the decision is made, let's say if tribal languages were to be taught in Cameroon, and since they are in schools and since they are being taught in Zimbabwe, how do you feel educational institutions come to the decision of which languages to teach?
I think for Zimbabwe it's purely political in terms of who pushes what. Right now, the larger population in Zimbabwe, I believe, is Shona. And so, of course, it makes sense that we're going to push for Shona to be taught in schools. But then also, if you find the larger Ndebele populations will also opt into learning Ndebele. Even though they're taught in schools, there's some of them that are dying off. And that's mostly because either they have decided to not necessarily integrate into, I don't want to say the modern perspective, but you know what, they're still villages. Or like the people from the villages don't necessarily make up a significant population within the capitals or in the places of influence. And so they kind of die off. The selection is largely based on that. But I think something that's also interesting is that the selection also depends on how easy it is to learn it. For example, I'm not learning my tribal language within my educational system. I'm learning the chosen one. Of course, I'm not going to choose the hardest language in the directory of languages for me to teach these children because I still want them to pass. So there's also that. What's more palatable for people to learn, but then at the same time, what's more palatable socially. Tribal politics plays a lot into our general politics and into our social structures. We use English systems, and for you to be able to push them, you need to have the power and the capacity to push those. So for example, there's a small village close to Victoria Falls, the Tonga tribe. It's not as tangible for a Tonga to be able to push it into the education system and say, I want this particular population of children to learn this, even though it's an option. When I say political, I mean more so social structures dictate it. So because the larger population in the country is Shona, more people are learning Shona. And then because if you're Tonga and you're the only Tonga in a Shona class, they're most probably going to teach Shona and not Tonga. And then because of that, very few people know Tonga, except for example, their nuclear families.
I have a lot of my Shona friends in politics. Together we can gather and be like, okay, let's have this native language taught in schools. At least it will be our languages that are being taught in school. It's not any other language that was established by a colonial master.
I thought of how I knew a lot of Egyptians. They happen to come from higher economic classes and they barely speak Arabic, not close to fluent. And what I noticed was that, let's say 99% of them did not know much about the 2011 revolution in Egypt. So I think it is largely political. I 100% agree. When we also think about it, I feel like it boils down to how can we communicate. So for example, when the 2011 revolution happened in Egypt, there were mottos, slogans, things to carry onto the street with signs. There is a large body of revolutionary heritage of songs and poems and just all sorts of arts and cultural production that we have now. It's all in Arabic. No one sang a song in English through the government. And since there is a dictatorship back home, it gives the government an advantage for us not to be able to be connected to this heritage or to be fueled by this heritage. If we can't communicate among ourselves in our own countries, how can we do something for our countries? How can we change something? How can we improve anything? How can we communicate between ourselves to initiate a social development if it's not in colonial languages?
It would be possible if we don't think that one language is better than another one. But as everyone wants to advocate for their own language, how are we getting to a point where we all understand that it's not even about choosing my language over yours, it's actually about us communicating in our languages and any other language that is not colonial language. There is a need to advocate more about this issue, raise the sense of awareness in our communities so that at the end of the day we understand that let's pick one language, let's focus on that as long as it's not a colonial master language. But it's part of our culture, it's our identity.
Reaching unity or reaching a form of communication, and that's also a bit tricky because it doesn't always mean uniformity. On one side, we don't all need to speak absolutely one language to be able to have social communication. But on the other side, how many languages, what languages do we choose? So it is very tricky, but I feel also a lot of governments fell into the trap of uniformity versus unity. So if we want to be a united nation, we have to speak one language, which is very questionable. If we want to be a successful nation, it has to be a colonial language so that we access more resources. So it doesn't have to be one language, it could be multiple. But
you
do you think there's a way?
You mentioned being able to all communicate. without using colonial language. So are we going to communicate in two different languages? How are we going to understand ourselves? That's why I mentioned having one native language. Not that we are going to forget about all the 199 left and just choose one, emphasizing on one for it to be the national language. The fact that today Lingala is being spoken in Congo doesn't mean that they don't have any other native languages within Congo. They understood the fact that they needed one native language as their national language. If this could happen in Cameroon, I would be very happy for us. But today we are like fighting with one another, like choosing one tribe language rather than another one, as if we are saying that this tribe is better than this other one. But this is not the point.
We're faced with kind of a dilemma where I fundamentally believe that the continent was never meant to be uniform, as you were putting it. And that also is relevant within the respective countries themselves, where you have many national languages. So for example, the tribal dialects, you're saying you have different tribes. The moment that you decide we're going to find one out of the 200, I think is a problem. For example, I disagree with how Swahili is being pushed. I don't disagree with Swahili. I disagree with its pushing. Simply because I don't think that there should be a native language that we all say that we should all speak. But because of that, unfortunately, we do have to concede to some of the colonial realities that we have in front of us. There's that most of us speak English. And so maybe we can use it to our own advantage and say, okay, I feel like everyone within their own tribes, try your best to learn your tribal language. Because in learning your tribal language, you're learning your tribal history. And then now when we come and sit down at this table, we're now speaking for everyone. We're having a holistic conversation, not a conversation that is devoid of our history. I think there's strength in teaching people the native languages because it teaches them identity, not necessarily that people who don't speak it don't have identity. I believe that there is a specific aspect of your identity which lies within your native tongue. And because of that, you're then able to come and have, as you said, to connect with social movements and the like. You can't have that without understanding the social structures. A round table with people who only speak English, I think is very detrimental to what we'd want to see. But I think what we'd want is people who, not even that you speak it, but that you have some understanding of your native language. So like where it comes from, and then we can come and have a holistic conversation.
Do you guys think that pushing one language, so in this example Swahili, based on popularity only, do you think that's fair in the sense of individual identities?
Swahili is a coastal language. It was a trade language. It wasn't necessarily a language that spawned from the continent itself. It's a combination of different languages, and as well as Arabic has many roots. I think my disagreement is within the fundamental. So if you're saying that you don't want to learn English, you don't want to learn French because it has colonial roots, so does Swahili. So what's the conversation? There's too much contradiction in that, because then now I can stand up and say, okay, I'm Southern African. Southern African languages are not in Swahili. There's similarities, but it's not in Swahili. And so then now I feel as if my identity is not necessarily represented within this language that we've chosen for the continent. If I were to concede that Swahili is spoken within the continent because of how populated it is, I think my point still stands. I still need you to understand your own history for me to talk to you about your country. If the African Union were to sit down, the only significance that the representatives of the continent give within that conversation is their understanding of their own language and their own history. The language is within the history and vice versa. And so I think it takes away from that conversation if we only speak that. So in as much as it could be English, it could also be Swahili. They're the same thing. It's just we tend to say Swahili is an African language, but it's also colonially rooted.